were lost in the sound of the sea. Chapter 12 1943–9 The Years of Terror. Of the German occupation there is little to say, except that it caused the islanders to feel more appreciation for the Italians they had lost. It seldom happens that a people can learn to feel friendly towards their oppressors, but hardly since Roman times had there been any other kind of rule in Cephallonia. Now there were no more Italians working in the fields beside the farmers in order to escape the boredom of army life. There were no more football matches between teams that quarrelled and cheated. There were no flirtations with girls by soldiers who had a cigarette hanging from the corners of their mouths. There were no more voices sending out opera tunes across the pine trees of the mountains. Gone were the charming chicken thieves, and in their place came a period of time that the doctor recorded in his history as the worst time of all. The islanders remember that the Germans were not human beings. They were machines without principles, machines that only knew how to loot and kill, without any passion except the love of strength, and without belief except in their natural right to destroy an inferior race. The Italians had, of course, been thieves, but their shame, when caught, showed that they recognized their guilt. The Germans came into the house at any time of day, kicked over the furniture, beat the occupants, however old or young, and in front of their eyes carried away whatever they liked. Both Pelagia and her father were beaten at different times for no apparent cause. Drosoula had cigarettes burned into her skin for frowning at an officer. The doctor had all his precious medical equipment, gathered together over 20 years of poverty, broken in his presence by 4 officers whose hearts were as dark and empty as the caves of hell. When, in November 1944, the German troops were ordered to withdraw, they destroyed every building for which they found the time, and the inhabitants of Cephallonia rose up against them and fought them all the way to the sea. But the night before he left, Gunther Weber, who had ashamedly stayed away from the house since the time of the killings, brought his record player and his collection of Marlene Dietrich records and left them outside Pelagia's door, as he had promised in happier days. He wrote a note in Italian: "God be with you. I will remember you always." Pelagia hid the record player in the hole in the floor, with Antonio's mandolin and Carlo's papers, and it survived the terrible years that followed. The Germans left, and the celebrations began, but no sooner had the bells begun ringing than the members of the communist organization Hellas, now calling themselves IAM, came out from hiding and attempted to take control of the country. They formed workers' councils and elected themselves to every post of authority. In Cephallonia, the communists began to send awkward characters to prison camps. On the mainland they poisoned, with dead animals, the water of villages that opposed them. Into mass graves they threw the dead bodies of Greeks who had had their eyes torn out and their mouths cut into the shape of a smile. They kidnapped 30,000 little children and sent them across the border into Communist Yugoslavia to be taught how to be true communists. Hellas soldiers, captured by the British, were so frightened of their leaders that they begged to be allowed to remain in British prison camps. Pelagia and the doctor were 2 out of millions of people whose lives were forever destroyed by these butchers. the doctor was dragged away in the night by 3 men who had decided that since he was a doctor, he must be a fascist. They threw Pelagia into a corner and beat her unconscious with a chair. When Kokollos came out from his house to defend the doctor, he too was carried away, even though he was a communist. He was accompanied by Stamatis, a supporter of the royal family, and the 3 men were taken to the harbour for transportation. Pelagia did not know what had happened to her father, and none of the authorities would tell her. Alone in the house, penniless and helpless, for the first time in her life, she thought of ending everything by killing herself. The island seemed to be cursed by an endless series of oppressors. When would Antonia return? The war was continuing in Europe, and probably he was dead. She heard that the communists had been killing the Italian soldiers who had come to fight alongside them against the Greeks. Had the time come, finally, to hate the Greeks? Of the nations who had broken into her house to beat her and steal her possessions, only the Italians were innocent, it seemed. Fortunately, she had a friend. Drosoula had long known that Pelagia had lost her love for Mandras, and that by his long silence he had given up his rights. She knew also that Pelagia was waiting for an Italian, but she felt no bitterness, and never uttered a single word of blame. When Pelagia stumbled, bleeding through her door, after the communists had taken Dr. Ioannis, Drosoula, who had also suffered much, stroked her hair and uttered loving words, as if Pelagia were her own daughter. Within a week, she had closed up her little house on the harbour and moved into the doctor's house on the hill. She found his Italian gun in a drawer and kept it at her side in case of attack. Like Pelagia, Drosoula had been reduced by the war. The layers of fat had melted from her waist and thighs, and her great ugly moon of a face had sunk inwards. However, her tall, thin form and grey hairs demanded respect, and her unbroken spirit gave Pelagia strength. For comfort, they slept together in the doctor's bed, and by day they made plans to find supplies of food and listen to each other's complaints and stories. They dug for roots in the undergrowth, and Drosoula took her young friend down to the harbour to learn to fish. But Drosoula was out when Mandras returned, full of self-importance and new ideas, expecting the admiring attention of the young woman he had not seen for years, and determined to take revenge. He came in through the door without knocking, and leaned his gun against the wall. When she heard the noise in the kitchen, Pelagia, who was in her room, called out, "Drosoula?" A man came in who she did not recognize, except that he looked very like Drosoula had done before the war. There was the same swollen stomach and thighs, the same round, coarse face and thickened lips. Puzzled, Pelagia stood up. Mandras also was confused. There was something about this desperately thin, frightened girl that reminded him of Pelagia. But this woman had silver threads in her thin black hair. Her blouse and skirt hung straight to the ground. Her cheeks were hollow. He looked quickly around the room to see whether Pelagia was there, assuming that this must be a cousin or an aunt. "Mandras, is it you?" said the woman, and he recognized the voice. He stood, amazed and confused, with much of his hatred knocked out of him, while she looked at those coarse and altered features and felt deep disgust. "I thought you must be dead," she said finally. He closed the door and leaned against it. "You mean you were hoping I was dead? As you see, I am not. I am very much alive and well. Don't I get a kiss from my fiancé?" She advanced fearfully and placed a kiss on his right cheek. "I am glad you are alive," she said. He caught both her wrists and held them tightly. "I don't think you are. How is your father, by the way? Is he not here?" "Let me go," she said softly, and he did so. "The communists took him away," she told him. "Well, he must have done something to deserve it." "He did nothing. He healed the sick, and they beat me with a chair and took everything." "There must be reasons. The party is never wrong. Whoever is not with us is against us." She noticed that he wore the red star of Hellas sewn into the front of his cap. "You're one of them," she said. He leaned against the door, placing all his weight against it, increasing her sense of imprisonment and her fear. "Not just one of them, an important one of them," he stated, sounding pleased with himself, then added challengingly, "Soon we will have a nice big house to live in. When shall we get married?" She trembled, and, seeing this, his anger increased. "We will not be married," she said. "We were very young. It was not what we thought it was." "Not what we thought? And there was I fighting for Greece, thinking of you all day and dreaming of you at night. And now I come back at last and find a faded cow who has forgotten me." "What's the matter with you?" she asked. "The matter with me?" He took from his pocket a thick bundle of papers. "This is what is the matter with me." He threw them towards her feet, and she picked them up slowly. She held the bundle in her hands and realized that it consisted of her letters to him in Albania. "My letters?" she said, turning them over in her hands. Mandras gave a sudden roar of disgust, and, seizing the letters, he found the last one, held it up to the light, and read, "You never write to me, and at first I was sad and worried. Now I realize that you cannot care, and this has caused me to lose my love for you also. I want you to know that I have decided to release you from your promises. I am sorry." He gave a smile that was both humorless and threatening. "Yes, I'm able to read now, and this is what I found in the letters I'd been carrying next to my heart. And now I know the truth. Do you know the first thing I heard when I arrived back here? I heard, 'Mandras, did you hear about your old fiancée? She's going to marry an Italian.' So, you found a fascist for yourself, have you? Is this what I've been fighting for, you cow?" Pelagia stood up, her lips trembling, and said, "Mandras, let me out." "Let me out," he repeated. "Let me out. Poor little thing's frightened, is she?" He came up to her and struck her across the face so hard that she spun round before she fell. He kicked her in the stomach and bent down to pick her up by the wrists. Then he threw her on the bed and, quite against his original intentions, began to tear at her clothes. This rape of women was something that he could not help, it seemed. It was a feeling that came from deep inside him, something he had learned in years of not needing to explain his actions to anyone. It was his natural right, and the violence was much more exciting than the sexual act itself. But Pelagia fought. Her nails broke in his flesh. She struck him with hands and knees and elbows. She screamed and struggled. To Mandras, her resistance was unreasonable. He was failing despite his weight and strength, and he sat back and hit her repeatedly. Then suddenly he tried to pull up her skirts. The solid weight of her gun fell out of its pocket and landed beside her head on the pillow, but Mandras did not see it, and when the bullet cracked through his shoulder, the shock knocked him backwards, and he gazed at Pelagia in shock and accusation. Drosoula heard the crack of the gunshot just as she came through the kitchen door, and at first she did not recognize the sound. But then she knew what it was, and took the Italian gun from the drawer. Without thinking, knowing that thought would make her a coward, she pushed open the door of Pelagia's room, and saw there the unthinkable. She had thought that Pelagia might have shot herself, that there might be thieves, but when she burst in, she saw the doctor's daughter leaning up on her elbow, her face swollen and bloody, her lips split, her clothes torn. Drosoula followed Pelagia's gaze and saw, leaning against the wall behind the door, a man who might have been her son. She ran to Pelagia's side and took her into her arms, rocking her, and heard the words, "He tried to rape me." Drosoula stood up, and mother and son examined each other in disbelief. So much had changed. As the anger grew in the woman, the fire in Mandras died. A wave of self-pity overcame him, and all he wanted to do was weep. Everything had come to nothing. Everything was lost. The horror of the war in Albania, the years in the forest, his new power and importance, it was all a dream, and he was a frightened little boy again, trembling before the anger of his mother. And his shoulder hurt so much. He wanted to show it to her, to win her attention. He wanted her to touch and heal it. But she pointed the gun at him and spat the one word that seemed to mean the most. "Fascist!" "Mother," he said in a voice that was low and frightened. "How dare you call me mother? I am no mother, and you are not my son. I have a daughter." She pointed to Pelagia, who had curled into a ball. "And this is what you do. I do not know you. Never in my life do I want to see you again. I have forgotten you. My curse goes with you. May you never know peace. May your heart burst in your chest. May you die alone." She spat on the ground and shook her head with disgust. "Pig rapist! Get out before I kill you!" Mandras left his gun leaning against the wall of the kitchen, and with bright red blood on his right hand, where he still held his wound, he stumbled out into the cold December sun. He looked through tearful eyes at the tree where once he had swung and laughed, and where, he seemed to remember, there had once been a goat. It was a tree that was incomplete without Pelagia as she was, fresh and beautiful, slicing onions beneath it and smiling through the tears. A wave of grief overcame him, and his throat tightened with sorrow. It did not occur to him that he was just one more life twisted and ruined by the war. He was aware only that heaven had disappeared, that hope had turned to dust, that joy, which had once shone brighter than the summer sun, had disappeared into the black light and cold heat of mass murder. He had struggled for a better world, and instead had destroyed it. There was once a place where all had shone with delight and innocence. He stood still for a moment, recalling where it was. Then he went down to the sea, stood on the waterline, and kicked off his boots. With his right hand he slowly removed his clothes till he stood with nothing on. He realized he wanted only to feel the sea and sand upon his skin. He needed to be washed. He remembered days in his boat with nothing to do except fish. He remembered his joy when something fine was landed for Pelagia, his pleasure at her pleasure when he gave it to her. He remembered that in those days he was beautiful. He began walking into the sea that would take his life, and by drowning him, make him clean, make him pure and innocent once more. Chapter 13. Antonia. There had been so many rapes that Pelagia and Drosoula were not surprised to find an abandoned bundle on their doorstep. It had been born at a time when its father could have been a German or a communist, and the mother might have been any unfortunate girl at all. Whoever this sorrowing and dishonoured girl had been, she had cared enough about her child to leave it upon the doorstep of a doctor's house, knowing that those inside would be able to cope. The disorder of the times was so great that the two women could think of no solution except to try and care for it themselves, thinking that in time the child could be adopted by someone childless, or handed to a charitable organization. They had taken the child inside and unwrapped it and discovered that it was a girl. She was very calm and cried only a little. She sucked the thumb of her right hand, a habit she never lost, even in old age, and she smiled a lot, her legs and arms waving up and down in delight. The two women, who had suffered so greatly from loss and unhappiness, found that the child, whom they named Antonia, gave new meaning to their lives. Because of her, the women's tragic memories began to fade, and she took her place in their lives as if she had always been meant to be there. In all her life, Antonia never asked a question about her father, and only when she applied for a passport to go abroad did she discover that she did not officially exist. She did have a grandfather, however. When Dr. Ianis returned, after 2 years, stumbling into the kitchen, supported by 2 charity workers, utterly broken by his treatment in the prison camp, and forever speechless, he bent down and kissed the child before retiring to his room. Just as Antonia did not inquire about a father, Dr. Ianis did not inquire about the child. It was enough for him to know that the world had gone down a path that he had no hope of understanding. He accepted that his daughter and Drosoula would sleep in his bed, and that he would take Pelagia's, because, whichever bed it was, he would dream the same dreams of a forced march of hundreds of kilometres without his boots, without food or water. He would hear the cries of villagers as their houses burned, the crack of gunshots as they were murdered, and he would witness, over and over again, Stamatis and Kokollos dying in each other's arms, and begging him to leave them in the road in case he himself was shot. In his wordlessness, Dr. Ianis drew the same comfort from Antonia that he had drawn from his daughter after his own young wife had died. He would put the child upon his knee, arranging her black hair, gazing into her brown eyes as if this alone was the way to speak, her smile filling his heart with sorrow, because, when she was old, she would lose her innocence, and learn that tragedy destroys the muscles of the face until a smile becomes impossible. In 1949, the national government succeeded at last in defeating the communists, who lost their control of the country. Dr. Ioannis took up medicine again, helping his daughter in a reversal of their roles. It upset Pelagia to see the shaking of his hands as he dealt with patients' wounds, and she knew also that he worked despite a terrible sense of uselessness. Why preserve life when all of us must die, when health is only an accident of youth? She wondered sometimes at the strength of his desire to heal, despite all he had suffered. In the evening, she wrapped her arms around him and held him as his mind wandered back over the past, his eyes wet with sadness, and she buried her head on his chest, understanding that by comforting him, she was comforting herself too. She attempted to interest him in working on his history, and when she took the papers from the hiding hole and arranged them in front of him at his table, he seemed willing enough to work. He read through them, but at the end of a week, Pelagia found he had added only one short paragraph in a shaky handwriting that did not look like his old, firm handwriting at all. Then she saw that across the bottom of the last page her father had written, "In the past, the horrors came from outside. Now we have only ourselves to blame." While she had been in the hiding hole, Pelagia had rediscovered Antonio's mandolin and Carlo's papers. She read through the latter in a single evening, and was astonished. She had never imagined that powerful, good-natured man had suffered so greatly from a secret sadness that had made him a stranger to himself. She saw that he had been as determined to lose his life as he had been to save Corelli's, and she realized that if her own adopted child was at risk, she would find the same extraordinary courage in herself. Antonia grew tall and lovely, a child whose movements were filled with confidence and grace. She was incapable of behaving like a lady, and when she sat in her grandfather's armchair, she not only sucked her thumb, but also hung one leg over the arm of the chair, ignoring her mother's and Drosoula's protests with laughing cries of, "Don't be so old-fashioned." The family were regarded as eccentric. The empty-headed gossips of the village regarded Drosoula, with her extreme ugliness, and Pelagia, with her assumption that she was any man's equal, as a pair of crazy women. Children threw stones at them as they passed, and adults warned their children to keep away, and encouraged their dogs to bite them. Nevertheless, Pelagia earned a living, because after darkness people would arrive secretly in the belief that her treatments were sure to work. During all this time, Pelagia became certain that Antonio Corelli was dead, and, like her father, she also became certain, beyond doubt, of the reality of ghosts. It had happened first in 1946, when, one day in October, she was standing outside the house with the infant Antonia in her arms. She was making baby noises, and giving the baby her finger to suck, when something made her look up. She saw a figure dressed in black, standing before her in exactly the same place that Mandras had been when he had been shot by Belisarius's cannon. The figure was looking at her, as if it wanted to take a step towards her, and her heart leapt. There was an atmosphere around him of 9,000 weeping ghosts, and sorrow seemed to pour from his face. Thin and bearded though he was, she was sure it was him. Excited beyond all joy, she put the baby down in order to run to him. But when she looked up, he had gone. Her heart jumping in her chest, she ran, Around the bend she stopped and looked wildly around, crying out, "Antonio! Antonio!" But no voice responded, and no man came towards her. He had disappeared. Her hands rose to the sky in confusion and fell down again to her sides. She stood watching and calling until her shouts hurt her throat and tears blinded her eyes. The same ghost appeared at the same place in 1947, and every year after that at roughly the same time, but never exactly. It was because of this that Pelagia came to the conclusion that Antonio had kept his promise to return, and that it was possible to keep such a promise and continue to love even from beyond the grave. She was able to live satisfied, knowing that she had not been abandoned, and, filled with happy dreams of being desired and loved, she looked forward to her own death, when she would once again have all that had been stolen away in life. Chapter 14. 1953. Earthquake. The 13th of August, 1953, was a fine day, with small white clouds scattered here and there most charmingly in the deep blue sky. That morning, Antonia, now 8 years old, but as tall as a child of 12, went to pick up a sheet of paper from the floor, and when the sheet flew upwards and stuck to her hand, she cried, "It's magic!" and ran excitedly outside. Strange things were happening all over the Ionian Islands. There were no birds in the sky. On the hillsides and in the undergrowth, snakes and rats left their holes, and in the villages all the dogs began barking. Drosoula came inside, sweating and shaking, and told Pelagia, "I am ill. I feel terrible. Something has happened to my heart." She sat down heavily with her hand to her chest, taking deep breaths, and Pelagia went to her medicine cupboard and made a drink for her. Antonia, who had come back inside, suddenly burst into tears, exclaimed, "Mama, I've got to get out," and ran outdoors. Drosoula and Pelagia were exchanging surprised glances when suddenly there came a low, terrible roar from the earth that made the two women feel as if their hearts were exploding in their chests. A heart attack, thought Pelagia desperately, and she saw Drosoula, with her hands on her stomach and her eyes staring, stumble as if someone had struck her. It seemed that time had stopped, and the indescribable roaring of the earth would never end. Dr. Ianis rushed out of the room that used to be Pelagia's, and spoke for the first time in years. "Get out! Get out!" he cried. "It's an earthquake! Save yourselves!" His voice sounded small and far away, and immediately afterwards he was thrown violently sideways. More frightened than they had ever been in their lives, the two women stumbled towards the door, were thrown down, and attempted to crawl. But again and again they were thrown upwards and sideways, and, unable to crawl on their hands and knees, they spread their hands and legs and moved towards the door like snakes, reaching it just as the roof began to fall in. Outside, in the yard, dust was slowly rising as the earth went up and down, while in the centre of the street a stream of water suddenly rose to a height of 12 meters, and then disappeared as if it had never been. Houses suddenly leapt upwards, and solid stone walls moved like paper in the wind, and then suddenly there was a stillness like that of death. Pelagia, spitting and covered in dirt, filled with a sense of utter helplessness, began to struggle to her knees. Suddenly the strange silence was broken by the wild cries of the priest, who rushed from the church with his arms raised to heaven. "You pig!" he roared. "You evil dog!" He fell to his knees, and with tears in his eyes, struck at the earth with his fists. At this point, as if in response to his cries, the terrible roaring began again, and once more the Cephalonian earth danced, the peaks of the mountains rocking like boats. During those intervals when the motion stopped, Pelagia, Drosoula, and Antonia held tightly onto each other, gazing in horror at the old house, of which there was little left. The walls were reduced to half their height, and the roof lay in ruins on the floor. This ruin contained the sad soul and tired old body of the doctor, who had planned his last words for years, and now died beneath the stones without the chance to say them. The British were the first to arrive, sending 4 large ships carrying water, food, medicines, doctors, and rescue equipment. Italy, remembering its shameful past, sent ships loaded with rescue workers, and American ships arrived carrying earthmovers, helicopters, and 3,000 sailors. The Greek navy turned up late but eager, and the King of Greece and his family travelled around the islands. The earthmovers began the slow work of clearing the ruined houses, and foreign aid workers built cities of tents as temporary accommodation for the islanders. Aeroplanes and helicopters dropped food to hillside communities whose roads had been cut off by the earthquake. In Cephallonia, because of the wide streets and the fact that most buildings were only 1 story high, few people actually died in the earthquake. There were the usual stories concerning people who had lost their sense of time and appeared from beneath the ruins of houses after 9 days, believing it had been a few hours. The islanders reacted differently, according to whether or not they found a natural leader among themselves. Where none appeared, people became sad and purposeless, and had terrible dreams of falling into endless space. During the earthquake itself, perhaps a quarter of the islanders, like the doctor, had remained calm, but afterwards the remaining 3/4 suffered terrible shame, remembering the way they had abandoned their children and elderly parents. Although he had always been considered a slow-thinking man, Belisarius, who was now 42 years old and stronger than he had ever been, took command in Pelagia's village. With a strength that seemed greater than that of the earthquake itself, he threw off the beams and stones that imprisoned the crushed body of the doctor, because he was aware that decay was followed by disease. Then he gathered together the confused and hopeless villagers and ordered them into small working parties. For months after the earthquake, there were times when the earth would shake and tremble, not violently as it had done in the earthquake itself, but enough to make people scream in fear. It was Belisarius who told people to get back to work, threatening them with broken bones unless they returned to their tasks. Even Pelagia, who was almost crazy with grief, was given the work of caring for people's wounds, while Drosoula, who at first could only cry, was put in charge of the children so that their parents could work. When the aid workers finally arrived at the village, they found a small community living in tents made of sheets of iron, with toilets dug at a safe distance from the water supply. An enormous man was in charge, who, in old age, would be more loved and respected than the teacher or the priest. For 3 months the earth moved, as if it was breathing. Then, at last, it became quiet and motionless once again, and reconstruction began, to be completed 3 years later. Ancient and beautiful Italian towns were rebuilt as plain white boxes. Pelagia's village was put up further down the hill, and her old house was abandoned, the contents of the hiding hole in the kitchen buried, it seemed, forever. The earthquake changed lives so greatly that, even today, it is still the most important topic of conversation in Cephallonia. Islanders cannot resist informing strangers of the facts, and tourist guides will mention the earthquake when it seemed they were only going to discuss the weather. Old people remember an event according to whether it was before or after the earthquake. The disaster caused people to recall the war as unimportant by comparison, and they woke up each morning amazed and grateful to be alive. In the new house that Pelagia, Drosoula and Antonia now lived in, Pelagia's guilt was the central issue in the three women's lives. The thought that she had played a part in her father's death made Pelagia suffer horribly. "He was 70, said Drosoula sensibly. "It was better to die quickly like that, trying to save us." But Pelagia could not accept this. She knew that in the moment of disaster, her mind had been spinning with nothing except the need to save herself, and she knew that when her father had fallen, she should have tried, even at the risk of her own life, to drag him through the door before the roof fell in. She fell into a bottomless pit of self-blame, took no interest in her appearance, and did not perform her household tasks, preferring to sit by the doctor's grave, chewing her lips until they bled. With her untidy greying hair and her pale face, she simply sat and watched, as if expecting his ghost to rise up through the earth and speak to her. Time after time, in the winter storms and rains, Drosoula and Antonia would go to the grave and drag Pelagia away, while she sighed and wept. One day, Antonia and Drosoula could stand no more. They began to feel impatient and angry, and the old woman and the young girl discussed how they could cure Pelagia of her sorrow. "Why don't we just tie her to the bed and hit her?" suggested Antonia. Drosoula sighed with pleasure at the thought, and for a moment wondered whether or not it would work. Then her eyes brightened, and she kissed the young girl on the top of her forehead. "I've had an idea," she said. At breakfast the next morning, Antonia suddenly announced, "I had a dream about Grandad last night." "That's funny," said Drosoula, "so did I." They looked at Pelagia for some kind of reaction, but she simply continued to tear a piece of bread into tiny pieces. "He told me he was glad he was dead," said Antonia, "because now he can be with Mamma's mother." "That's not what he told me," replied Drosoula, and Pelagia asked, "Why are you talking as if I'm not here?" "Because you're not," replied Drosoula truthfully. "You haven't been here for a long time." "What did he tell you then?" inquired Antonia. "He told me that he wants Mamma to write the history of Cephallonia that got buried in the earthquake. He said it spoils the fun of being dead, knowing that it's got lost." Pelagia regarded them suspiciously, and Antonia asked her innocently, "So, are you going to write it?" "There's no point in asking her," said Drosoula. "She's on another planet." "That's not true," protested Pelagia. "Welcome back," said Drosoula rudely. Pelagia went back to her father's grave and thought about what Drosoula had said. Although she knew that the story of the dream was nonsense, It occurred to her that rewriting the history would indeed be a way to keep her father's spirit alive. She travelled into Argostoli and returned with pens and a thick pad of paper. It was surprisingly easy. Although the history had been destroyed in the earthquake, she had read it so many times that the old phrases rolled through the kitchen door and flowed down her arm and right hand into her pen. The ancient, half-forgotten island of Cephallonia rises from the Ionian Sea. Drosoula and Antonia spied on her as she sat at her table, tapping her teeth with her pen. They crept away to a safe distance, embraced each other, and danced. Pelagia almost became the doctor. She did hardly any housework, leaving it all to the women. Her father's pipe had been found in the ruins of the old house, and she stuck it between her teeth as he had done, but did not light it. She began to add small details to the text that she remembered so well, supplying information about such matters as clothes and baking, and the cruel but traditional treatment of widows. The joy of the work caused a deep change in her. She sent letters of inquiry to universities and discovered that all over the world there were people who loved knowledge so much that they would spend months making inquiries on her behalf. Finally, at the end of 1961, she put her completed work into an enormous file and wondered what to do next. She learnt from publishers that such a book would have no market, and was advised instead to give it to a university. "I will when I'm dead," thought Pelagia, and she left it proudly on her shelf as visible evidence of the fact that she was an intellectual in the tradition of the ancient Greeks. By this time, Antonia was a fresh and beautiful 17-year-old who opposed her adopted mother's ideas as a matter of principle, and the two would sit up late into the night discussing philosophy. "When you're my age, you'll look back and see I was right," Pelagia would say. Antonia had no intention of reaching Pelagia's age, and said so. "I want to die before I'm 25, she said. "I don't want to get old. You old people caused all the problems, and it's us young ones who have to solve them." "Enjoy your dreams," commented Pelagia. Chapter 15. Alexei. It was about this time that mysterious postcards in rather poor Greek began to arrive from all over the world. From Santa Fe came one that said, "You would like it here. All the houses are made of mud." From London, "Mad people, terrible fog." From Madrid, "Too hot, everyone asleep." Although Pelagia's first thought was that her father's ghost was visiting his favourite countries and was sending her communications from beyond the grave, her second thought was that they might be from Antonio. But he too was dead. Perhaps, she thought, these unsigned cards were from someone with whom she had exchanged letters during the writing of the history. Puzzled, but pleased, she tied her collections of cards together and put them in a box. "You've got a secret boyfriend," suggested Antonia, who was pleased to discuss the matter since it drew attention away from her own romantic affairs, which both Pelagia and Drosoula were attempting to discourage. They had met while Antonia was earning a little money by serving coffee in a cafe on the plaza of Argostoli. There had been a noisy band playing in the square, and the gentleman, who had had to rise and shout his order in the young girl's ear, had, at the same moment, realized what a deliciously attractive ear it was. Antonia had also realized that here was a man whose eyes expressed exactly the correct mixture of strength and gentleness, calmness and humour. Alexei waited at the cafe day after day, choosing the same table whenever he could, his heart bursting with his desire to see the tall young woman with her perfect teeth and long fingers. She brought him his coffee eagerly, forbidding the other girls, the waiters, and even the owner himself to serve him. One day he took her hand while she was putting down a cup, looked passionately up at her and said, "Marry me." Alexei was a lawyer whose skilful speeches could make a judge weep, but while Pelagia recognized his excellence in this area, she could not stand the thought of him marrying Antonia. She was very tall, he was short. She was only 17, and he was 32. She was tall and graceful. He was overweight, and had a habit of tripping over things. Pelagia remembered her passion for Mandras at the same age, and forbade the marriage, certain that this was the right thing to do. The wedding day was nevertheless delightful. Antonia, beaming with happiness, kissed even the strangers who had come to stare, and Alexei, sweating with alcohol and joy, made a long and extremely poetic speech, much of it very wisely in praise of his mother-in-law. She would always remember the exact moment during the celebrations when she had seen what it was about him that had awakened Antonia's heart. It was when he put his arm around her, kissed her on the cheek and said, "We are going to buy a house in your village with your permission." The humble tone of his voice, and his implied doubt that she might not want him near her, was enough to cause her to become extremely fond of him. While Pelagia waited impatiently for a grandchild, Drosoula became deeply involved in work. In the empty space by the harbour, that had once been her own house, she put up a wooden roof and some romantic lamps. She borrowed some ancient tables and chairs, bought a cheap oven, and grandly started the taverna that she would run eccentrically, but with great success, until the day of her death in 1972. It was the 1960s, and tourists were just beginning to arrive in Cephallonia. Wealthy boat owners passed on information to their friends about the most unusual places to eat. German soldiers, who had turned into gentle citizens with vast families, brought their sons and daughters and told them, "This is where Daddy was in the war. Isn't it beautiful?" Italians arrived by ferry, bringing their pretty white dogs. Consequently, as the owner of the only taverna in the little port, Drosoula earned enough in the summer to do nothing at all in the winter. Lemoni, who was now married, immensely fat, and the mother of 3 children, helped with the serving, and Pelagia came down, taking the opportunity to practice her Italian. The service was not fast. To tell the truth, it was extremely slow. The guests were treated unapologetically as members of Drosoula's patient family, and quite often there was no service at all if Drosoula happened to like a particular customer with whom she was deep in conversation. The foreigners, who loved and feared her, never complained about her forgetfulness and her indefinite delays, and would say, "She's so nice, poor old thing. It seems a shame to hurry her." Meanwhile, year after year, Pelagia waited for a grandchild that never came. "It's my body," declared Antonia, "and I have the right to choose. Anyway, the world's population is already too large. Alexei agrees with me, so don't think you can go and shout at him." "I'm getting old," Pelagia would say, "that's all." Time passed. It was Drosoula who died first, perfectly upright in her rocking chair, so quietly that it seemed she was apologizing for having lived at all. She was a courageous woman who had lived a few short years of happiness with a husband that she had loved, a woman who had rejected her son as a matter of principle and lived the rest of her days in willing service to her adopted family. After Drosoula was buried near the doctor, Pelagia realized that she was now truly alone. She had no idea anymore how to run a life, and it was with fear and hopelessness in her heart that she took over Drosoula's taverna and attempted to make a living. Alexei, who by his early 30s had lost all his hair, achieved success as a lawyer, as Pelagia had known he would, and acquired, among other things, a big Citroën car. When at last, in 1979, Antonia gave in to the demands of nature and became pregnant, she and Alexei started to hold hands again in public, stared dreamily at babies, and made long lists of possible names. "It's going to be a girl," said Pelagia. "Really, you must call her Drosoula." "But Drosoula was so big and ugly." "It doesn't matter. We loved her anyway. Her name should live." "Oh, I don't know, Mama." "I am an old woman," declared Pelagia, who gained great satisfaction from repeating this statement. "It might be my last wish." "You're 60. These days that isn't old." "Well, I feel old." "You don't look it." "I didn't bring you up to be a liar," said Pelagia, terribly pleased, nevertheless. "I'm 34, said Antonia. "That's old." When the little boy appeared, Pelagia began to refer to the child as Ioannis, and she did this so frequently that it soon seemed obvious to its parents that it could not be called by any other name. If you called it Ioannis, it smiled and blew bubbles, so Ioannis it was. Alexei, now realizing that a man must pass something on to his son, began to look around for good investments. He built a small block of holiday apartments and installed a modern kitchen and toilets in the taverna. He persuaded Pelagia to allow him to hire a proper cook, leaving her as the manager, and they split the profits 50-50. On the white walls, Pelagia stuck all the postcards that continued to arrive from the 4 corners of the world. Chapter 16. An Unexpected Lesson. At 5 years old, Ioannis, who spent nearly all his time at the taverna in his grandmother's care, already knew how to say hello and "Isn't he sweet?" in 6 different languages. The reason for his continual presence at the taverna Drosoula was that his father was building new holiday apartments and tennis courts, and his mother was opening shops that sold cheap souvenirs all over the island. Their son grew up contentedly in his grandmother's company, playing in the clear waters of the port, and slowly learning the Italian that Pelagia insisted on speaking to him. In the evening, the reunited family would sit together in the taverna, arguing both in Italian and in Greek, while Pelagia would embarrass Ioannis with references to his infant years. When he was 10 years old, Pelagia hired a bouzouki player to entertain her guests in the taverna. His name was Spiridon, and he played his bouzouki with such skill that he could persuade even the Germans to put their arms around each other's shoulders and dance in a circle while stamping on the floor. Ioannis loved Spiridon, with his broad shoulders and his wide mouth that seemed to contain 100 flashing teeth. Pelagia also loved him, because he reminded her of her long-lost captain, and occasionally her heart wished desperately for a time machine to take her back to the days of the only real love of her life. Ioannis did not fail to notice that Spiridon was popular with women, who, at the end of every performance, would seize the red roses from the vases in the middle of their tables and throw them at him. So one day Ioannis demanded that Spiridon should teach him how to play the bouzouki. "Your arms aren't long enough yet," said Spiro. "It would make more sense to start with a mandolin. It's the same thing, really, but small enough for you." "Will you teach me to play it?" "Of course, but we'll have to find a mandolin. Otherwise we might have to do just the theory." Ioannis begged his mother and father to get him one, and they promised to buy one when they next went to Athens, but forgot. Eventually Pelagia told him, "In fact, we have one already, but it's buried under the old house. I'm sure Antonio wouldn't mind you digging it up." "Who's Antonio?" "My Italian fiancé, who was killed in the war. It belonged to him. There was a big trapdoor in the middle of the floor, and it was in a hole underneath." So Ioannis dragged Spiridon up the hill and showed him a ghostly ruin overgrown with long grass, its broken stones just visible above the growth. All around it lay the silent and deserted remains of lonely little houses. "It's the saddest place," said Ioannis. "I come here to explore sometimes." He pointed. "My grandfather died in there. I'm named after him. Grandma says he was the best doctor in Greece, and that he could cure people by touching them." The two of them went through what had once been the door and scratched their heads when they saw the rubbish that lay all around. Spiro blew out his cheeks and sighed. "We've got 2 days' work here," he said. "We'll just have to get on with it." By the next evening there was a clear space in the middle of the old floor, and the trapdoor lay revealed in the area that had once been the kitchen. Spiro tried to get his fingers under the iron ring of the door, but, hard as he tried, he could not move it. He and the child were gazing at the ring and scratching their heads when they became aware of a very big old man in a black suit, standing a little bent in the doorway. "What are you doing?" he asked. "Oh, it's you, young Ioannis. I thought you were looters." "We're trying to open this," said the boy. "It's stuck, and it's got something inside that we want." The old man came inside and examined the trapdoor with his watery eyes before slowly bending down and putting the tips of the fingers of one hand under the iron ring. He leaned sideways, putting all his weight and strength into lifting the ring, and, with a sudden loud crack, the door flew upwards in a cloud of dust. Velisarius rubbed his hands together, blew on the tips of his fingers, and seemed suddenly to become a tired old man again. "Goodbye, my friends," he said, and made his way slowly down the path to the new village. "Unbelievable," said Spiro. Inside the hiding place, in perfect condition, they found an antique German record player, a handmade blanket, a bundle of papers written in Italian, and another package of papers with the title A Personal History of Cephallonia. There was also a cloth bundle containing the most beautiful mandolin that Spiro had ever seen. When Ioannis showed Pelagia the mandolin, she started crying, and to Ioannis's amazement, she did not stop for a whole week. Ioannis comforted her as best he could, climbing onto her knees, which he was really a little too old for, and wiping her tears, wondering how it was possible to love an old woman with stiff knees and thin grey hair so much. While Ioannis comforted Pelagia, Spiro carefully cleaned and polished the mandolin. He tightened and tuned each string, and told Ioannis with great seriousness, that the mandolin was the most precious thing he would ever own, so that Ioannis learned to regard the instrument with a respect that he had never felt in church when dragged there by Pelagia. In October 1993, Ioannis was 14, and he had had a whole summer in which to play in public with Spiridon and have red roses thrown at him. In order not to annoy his grandmother with his constant practising, in fact, not to make her cry again, he had gone up to the ruins of the old house to play in private, and was concentrating very hard on a particularly difficult piece of music. He was biting his lip with the effort, and did not notice an old man who approached him and watched him with critical but delighted interest. Ioannis nearly jumped out of his seat when a voice said, in a very strange accent, "Excuse me, young man." "Ah!" Ioannis exclaimed. "You frightened me." "I couldn't help noticing," said the man, "that you are doing something wrong." "I know. I'm having trouble with this piece," replied Ioannis, noticing how unusually bright-eyed the old man was, and how there was about him an atmosphere of energy and laughter. "Let me show you how to place your fingers." The old man came over to Ioannis and started to pull the boy's fingers into place, explaining as he did so why the fingers were better in this position. Then he stood upright and added, "You can always tell a really good musician, because a good musician doesn't seem to be moving his fingers at all." "You seem to know a lot about it," said Ioannis. "Well, I ought to. I've been a professional mandolin player for nearly all my life. I can tell that you're going to be good." "Play me something?" asked the boy, offering him the mandolin. The old man took the mandolin, settled it into his body, and began to play in such a way that Ioannis's mouth fell open with amazement. Suddenly the old man stopped, turned the mandolin over, examined it with an expression of disbelief, and exclaimed, "Mother of God, it's Antonia." "How did you know it's called Antonia?" asked Ioannis, both surprised and suspicious. "Have you seen it before?" "Where did you find it? Who gave it to you?" "I dug it out of that hole," said Ioannis, pointing to the open trapdoor. "Grandma told me it was there." "And would your grandmother be Kyria Pelagia, daughter of Dr. Ioannis?" "That's me. I'm called Ioannis, after him." The old man sat next to the boy on the wall, still holding the mandolin, and wiped his forehead with a handkerchief, seeming suddenly very anxious. "Tell me, young man, is your grandmother alive? Is she happy?" he asked finally. "She cries sometimes, ever since we dug Antonia and all the other things out of the hole." "And what about your grandfather? Is he well?" The boy seemed confused. "What grandfather?" he asked. "Not your father's father. I mean Kyria Pelagia's husband," said the old man, wiping his forehead again. "There isn't one. I didn't even know she had one." "Are you saying that Kyria Pelagia hasn't got a husband? You haven't got a grandfather?" "I suppose I must have, but I've never heard of him. I've only got my father's father, and he's half dead." The old man stood up, looked around him and said, "This was a beautiful place. I had the best years of my life here. And do you know what? I was going to marry your grandmother once. I think it's time I saw her again." The two of them were walking down the hill, when Ioannis stopped suddenly. If you're the one who played the mandolin and was going to marry Grandma, does that mean you're the ghost?" The autumnal sun shone briefly through the cloud, and the old man paused for thought. Chapter 17. The Return. Antonio Corelli, although in his 70s, rediscovered a certain youthful energy in his old limbs as he danced about, trying to avoid being hit by the frying pans that Pelagia was busily throwing at him. "You pig!" she screamed. "All my life waiting, all my life thinking you were dead, and you alive and me a fool! How can you break such promises, betrayer?" Corelli backed against the wall, trying to hold off the broomstick that Pelagia was waving at him. "I told you," he cried. "I thought you were married." "Married?" she exclaimed bitterly. "No such luck, thanks to you, you rat!" She made a move as if she was going to hit him across the head with the broom handle. "I came back for you, 1946. I came round the bend, and there you were with the little baby, looking so happy. Was I married? Who told you that? So, I adopt a baby that someone leaves on my doorstep. Couldn't you have said, 'Excuse me, but is this your baby?' Please stop hitting me. I came back every year. You know I did. You saw me. I always saw you with the child. I was so bitter I couldn't speak. But I had to see you." "Bitter? I don't believe my ears. You bitter?" "For 10 years, said Corelli. "For 10 years I was so bitter that I even wanted to kill you. And then I thought, well, okay, I was away for 3 years. Perhaps she thought I wasn't coming back. Perhaps she thought I was dead. Perhaps she thought I'd forgotten. Perhaps she met someone else and fell in love. As long as she's happy. But I still came back every year just to see you were all right. Is that betrayal? And did you ever see a husband? And did you think what it did to me when I ran to you and you disappeared? Did you think about my heart?" "Okay, so I jumped the wall and hid. I had to. I thought you were married. I told you. Pelagia, please, this is a terrible embarrassment for the customers. Can't we go for a walk and talk about it on the beach?" She looked round at all the faces, some of them grinning, some of them pretending to look the other way. Everywhere there were overturned chairs and tables that Pelagia had thrown to the floor in her anger. "You should have died," she shouted, "and left me with my dreams. You never loved me." She marched out of the door, leaving Corelli bowing repeatedly to the customers and saying, "Please excuse us." 2 hours later, they were sitting on a familiar rock, gazing out over the sea at the yellow lights of the harbour reflected in the blackened waters. "I see you got my postcards, then," he said. "In Greek. Why did you learn Greek?" "I was ashamed of being an invader. I was so ashamed that I didn't want to be Italian anymore. I've been living in Athens for about 25 years. I'm a Greek citizen." "Did you become a composer?" "Yes, I've played my music all over the world. I wrote my first big piece of music for you. It's called Pelagia's March." He noticed that she was trying not to cry, and thought how emotional she had become in her old age. She had even knocked out his false teeth, so that they had fallen in the sand and had to be washed in the sea. "I feel like an unfinished poem," said Pelagia with a heavy sigh. Corelli felt a sting of shame and avoided a reply. "Everything's changed. Everything here used to be so pretty, and now the houses look like boxes made of cement. And we have electricity and telephones, and running water, and proper toilets, and earthquake-resistant houses. Is that so bad?" There was a silence, during which the thoughts of both of them returned to the past. "I see you still have my ring," he said. "Only because I couldn't get it off," she answered. "I had it altered to fit, and now I regret it." She hesitated. "So, did you get married? I suppose you did?" "Me? No. As I said, I was very bitter for years and years. I was horrible to everyone, especially women. And then I became successful, and I was all over the world, flying from one place to another. And anyway, who wants to be with someone who is dreaming of someone else?" "Antonio Corelli, I can see that you can still tell lies with your silver tongue. And how can you bear to look at me now? I'm an old woman. I feel ashamed to be so old and ugly. You look the same, just old and thin, but I look like someone else, I know it. I want you to remember me properly. Now I'm just a lump." "You forget that I came to spy on you. If you see things happen gradually, there's no shock. You're just the same." He squeezed her hand gently and said, "Don't worry, it's still Pelagia. Pelagia with a bad temper, but still Pelagia." "Did you ever think that I might have been raped, and that was why I had a baby?" "Yes, I did." "And?" "I admit it made a difference. We had some ideas about dishonour then, didn't we? Thank God we're not so stupid now." "The man who tried to rape me, I shot him." He looked at her in disbelief. "You shot him?" "I was never dishonoured. He was the fiancé I had before you." "You never said anything about a fiancé." "Jealous?" "Of course I'm jealous." The emotion was beginning to stir him a little too much, and he tried to control his feelings. Pelagia decided it was time to change the subject. "I want to show you something. You never read Carlo's papers, did you? Come back to the taverna and eat, and I'll give you his writing. We do an excellent snails dish." "Snails!" he exclaimed. "I remember all about snails." Corelli sat at the table with its plastic cloth and read through the stiff old sheets that had curled up at the corners. As he read, he frowned, and once or twice he blinked as if in disbelief. When he had finished reading, Pelagia came and sat opposite him. "Well?" she asked. He tapped the pile of papers. "I wish you hadn't shown me these. I'm more old-fashioned than I thought. I had no idea." "He loved you. Are you disgusted?" "Sad. It's a shock. I can't help it." "He wasn't just another hero, was he? He was more complicated. Poor Carlo." They began to talk more freely. "Are you very famous, then?" Pelagia asked. "Only in the sense that other musicians have heard of me. I've retired now. In fact, I was thinking, I want to rebuild the old house. I want to live in a nice place, a place with memories." "Without water and electricity?" "I'll put them in. Would you sell me the site?" "You're insane. I don't even know if we own it." "Then you don't mind? I'd pay you to come and clean it," he said wickedly. She took him seriously. "What? Do I need money? With this taverna? Go home to Athens. Anyway, Lemoni would do it. Little Lemoni, she's still here? She's as big as a ship and a grandmother. He fell silent again, remembering the past, then said, So, do I have your permission to rebuild the house? No, she said, still holding on to her anger. Oh. He looked at her doubtfully. He would return to the topic at a later date, he decided. I'm going to come and see you tomorrow, he said. With a surprise. I don't want any surprises. Go to hell with your surprises. You owe me a life. Ah, I'll bring you a life, then. Stupid old man. He turned up the next day with screaming brakes in a cloud of blue smoke. Pelagia shook her head disapprovingly as he climbed carefully off the motorbike, which was bright red and looked as if it had been designed for racing. "Do you know where we're going?" the captain said. "We're going to see if Casa Nostra is still there." He tapped the machine. "On a motorbike." "Do you really think the hut survived the earthquake? And do you really think I'm going on a thing like that at my age?" "I hired it specially. It goes very well." "No," she said. "My knees are too stiff." "Don't you want to see Casa Nostra?" "Not with a madman." "I've got it for 2 days. We can sit on a rock and watch the sea." It took a long time to persuade her. As they swung dangerously from side to side along the stony roads, she held on tightly to his waist, her face buried between his shoulders. Corelli noticed that she held on to him even more desperately than in the old days, and from time to time he deliberately swung to one side of the road so that she would hold him tighter. "May the saints save me," thought Pelagia, and in search of safety slid her arms right round his waist and linked her fingers together.